A rusty piece of metal can hold more love than a beating human heart. I did not know the sad truth when I was 12 years old. My name is Elara. I was a quiet child who played the piano. I played beautifully, but my house was always filled with a cold, heavy silence. My father, Elias, was a strange, lonely clockmaker. He never smiled. He never hugged me. After my mother died in a terrible car accident, he completely changed. He locked himself inside his dark workroom every single day. I just wanted him to look at me. I wanted him to listen to my music. I practiced the piano for 6 hours every day. My small fingers hurt terribly. I played loud, classical music hoping the beautiful sound would reach his locked door. But the heavy wooden door never opened. He stayed inside, hunched over his old desk with a thick magnifying glass. He was not fixing elegant clocks. He was obsessed with an ugly, burned block of metal. It was a rusty piece of dark garbage from the police station. It came from the tragic car crash that killed my mother. I thought my father had gone completely crazy. He loved a dead machine more than me. The day of the city's biggest piano competition finally arrived. I wore a beautiful white dress. I played my music perfectly and won the golden first-place trophy. I looked out at the large, cheering crowd, searching for my father's face. But his seat was completely empty. He did not come. My heart broke into pieces. That night, I walked back into our dark, quiet house. I was carrying my shiny golden trophy, but I felt incredibly angry and bitter. I walked directly to his workroom. For the first time in years, the heavy door was slightly open. I pushed it hard, ready to scream and break his stupid tools. I stepped inside the dark room and froze completely. My father was sitting at his messy desk. Dark red blood was dripping slowly from his left ear onto his white shirt. I gasped in pure shock. But he did not care about his bleeding ear at all. When he heard me, he quickly threw his arms over the ugly, burned metal block. He covered it with his body to protect it. He looked at me with wild, terrified eyes. He was hiding the rusty machine from his own daughter. I stepped forward angrily and grabbed a piece of paper from his desk. It was not a drawing of a clock or a pocket watch. The paper was an official, highly technical engineering report. I read the bold words on the top of the page. It was a detailed, complex manual for recovering audio data from a destroyed airplane black box. Why was a simple, small-town clockmaker studying advanced aviation technology? Why was he ignoring his bleeding ear to protect a piece of trash? I dropped the paper and ran out of the room. I was crying loudly, feeling completely confused and unloved. I thought he was just a crazy, broken man. I could not understand his strange obsession. The ugly block of metal was a dark ghost in our house. It belonged to my mother, Clara. She was a beautiful, warm woman with a bright smile. 15 years ago, she lost control of her car on a dangerous mountain road. Her car crashed deep into a rocky valley and burst into bright, hot flames. She died instantly in the terrible fire. I was only a baby when she passed away. I grew up believing that the burned metal block was an old, antique music box from her childhood. I thought my father kept it because it was a simple family memory. But a few weeks after the piano competition, I learned a shocking secret. I was walking home from school when I met the old local police chief. He was a kind man who knew my family very well. He saw me looking sad and bought me a warm cup of tea. We started talking about my father. Your father is a very complicated man, Elara, the old police chief said quietly. People in this town think he is crazy, but they do not know what happened after your mother's funeral. I listened closely, my heart beating fast. What happened? I asked. The police chief sighed deeply. That burned metal block is not an old family antique. Your father designed and built it himself. It was a very special, custom anniversary gift. He gave it to your mother the exact morning she died. My eyes widened in surprise. The ugly machine was a symbol of their tragic final day. But the police chief had an even darker secret to share. After Clara's funeral, your father completely disappeared, the old man whispered. We searched the entire town for 3 whole days and nights. We finally found him down in the deep, dangerous valley, the police chief continued. He was at the exact site of the terrible car crash. The ashes from the fire were still very hot. Your father was on his knees in the black dirt. He was digging through the burned metal of the car. He did not use a shovel or any tools, the old man said, shaking his head with sad tears in his eyes. He dug through the sharp glass and hot ashes with his bare hands. When we pulled him away, his hands were burned and cut down to the white bone. He almost destroyed his own hands just to find that small metal box, the police chief finished. I sat in the small cafe, completely frozen in shock. My father, the careful clockmaker, had ruined his delicate fingers in a pile of hot, sharp ashes. He had risked his life and his career for a broken, silent machine. I walked home slowly that afternoon. I looked at his locked workroom door with new, strange feelings. But this sad story did not make me love him more. It only made me feel more alone. He loved a ghost, not me. Years passed like a slow, painful dream. The quiet distance between my father and me grew into a massive, cold wall. I turned 18 years old. I was accepted into the most famous, prestigious music academy in the country. It was a huge, life-changing honor. I was leaving home tomorrow. It was my final night in the quiet house. I cooked a nice, warm dinner. I set 2 plates on the small kitchen table. I stood in front of his locked workroom door. I knocked softly. Dad, I called out. Dinner is ready. I am leaving for the academy tomorrow morning. I waited in the dark hallway for a long time. There was absolutely no answer. The heavy wooden door remained completely shut. I felt a familiar, sharp pain of rejection in my chest. I ate my dinner alone in silence. My sadness quickly turned into a hot, boiling anger. I decided to leave the house immediately. I packed my large suitcase with angry, shaking hands. Before leaving, I wanted to take my beautiful piano trophies with me. I walked to the glass cabinet in the living room. I looked inside and gasped loudly. The glass shelves were completely empty. Every single golden and brass trophy I had ever won was gone. My entire childhood of hard work had vanished. Where were they? A terrible, dark thought entered my mind. I walked quietly to my father's workroom. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open slowly and stepped inside. The room smelled like strong chemicals and hot, burning metal. My father was asleep in his chair. He looked incredibly thin and exhausted. I looked at his messy wooden desk. The ugly, burned metal block was sitting under a bright lamp. Next to it was a small, extremely hot melting pot. I walked closer to the hot pot. I looked inside and my heart stopped beating completely. I saw the melted, golden liquid of brass and copper. Beside the pot were tiny, perfectly shaped metal gears. And right next to the gears was a broken piece of my first-place piano trophy. He had stolen my beautiful awards. He had melted down my proudest life achievements in a hot fire. He destroyed my trophies just to cast tiny, stupid gears for his rusty, broken machine. He was using my successful, bright life to feed his dark, crazy obsession with the past. I felt a wave of absolute, pure hatred wash over my body. My father was not just a sad, lonely man. He was a selfish, terrible monster. He had destroyed my past, but I would not let him destroy my future. I grabbed my heavy suitcase from the hallway. I did not wake him up to say goodbye. I walked out the front door into the cold, dark night. I did not look back at the quiet house. I promised myself I would become the greatest piano player in the world, and I would never, ever speak to that crazy man again. Many busy, exciting years passed. I traveled across the entire world, playing my music in grand, beautiful concert halls. I became a famous, wealthy piano player. Thousands of people clapped and cheered for my name. But I never called my father. I completely erased him from my successful life. I was living my perfect dream, far away from the quiet, dark house. However, there was one strange, mysterious thing that happened before every major performance. No matter what city or country I was in, a small package always arrived in my private dressing room just before the concert began. Inside the package was always a classic, wooden metronome. It was a traditional tool used by musicians to keep perfect time. There was never a name or a return address on the box. I just assumed it was a gift from a very rich, dedicated, and mysterious fan. I collected over 20 of these beautiful, wooden metronomes. I kept them proudly on a large shelf in my modern city apartment. They were elegant and worked perfectly. I never thought about who sent them. I was too busy enjoying my fame and my beautiful, loud music. One rainy evening, I was cleaning my apartment. I was dusting the large shelf when my hand slipped. One of the wooden metronomes fell heavily to the hard floor. It crashed loudly, and the smooth wooden case cracked completely open. I sighed and knelt down to pick up the broken pieces. As I picked up the broken wood, I saw the complex machine inside. My highly trained eyes noticed something incredibly strange. The internal gears of the metronome were not made of cheap, factory metal. They were made of beautiful, shining, solid brass. They were crafted with absolute, perfect, microscopic precision. I picked up one of the tiny brass gears. I looked at the specific, golden color of the metal. My heart suddenly skipped a heavy beat. I remembered that exact, unique color from my childhood. It was the exact same color as my stolen, melted piano trophies. My breathing became very fast and shallow. I ran to my kitchen and grabbed a small hammer. I carefully broke open another wooden metronome from the shelf. Inside, I found the exact same custom, handcrafted brass gears. These were not cheap gifts from an anonymous music fan. They were built by a master clockmaker. Every single metronome was handmade by my father. He had used the brass from my melted childhood trophies to build the perfect rhythm for my adult music. He had never stopped watching me. He knew exactly where I was playing every single time. He had melted my past not to destroy it, but to build something that would guide my future. I sat on the floor surrounded by the broken wooden pieces. A confusing storm of old anger and new sadness swirled in my chest. But my heart was still too hard to forgive him. 5 more years passed. I fell deeply in love with a brilliant, kind man named David. He was a successful sound engineer. He understood my music and my quiet sadness. When he asked me to marry him, I said yes immediately. I was finally building my own happy family. As the beautiful wedding day approached, a heavy, dark feeling grew in my heart. I looked at the old metronomes on my shelf. Despite my deep anger, he was still my father. David gently encouraged me to reach out. He said a wedding was a time for forgiveness and new beginnings. I sat at my desk and wrote a long, emotional letter. I wrote about my pain, but I also wrote about forgiveness. I placed the letter and a beautiful, gold-printed wedding invitation into a thick envelope. I mailed it to the old, quiet house, hoping for a tiny miracle. I waited anxiously for a whole month. Every time the phone rang, my heart jumped. But the phone stayed silent. Finally, just 1 week before the wedding, the mailman brought a familiar, thick envelope. It was my own beautiful wedding invitation, returned completely unopened. I stared at the envelope in shock. Stamped across the front in cold, red ink were the harsh words, "Return to sender refused." My hands shook as I turned the envelope over. On the back, there was a small piece of rough paper taped to the clean white envelope. There were a few words written on the rough paper. The handwriting was terrible, messy, and extremely shaky. It did not look like the careful, precise handwriting of a master clockmaker. The note said, "I cannot leave the workshop. Do not bother me anymore." The cruel rejection hit me harder than a physical punch. I had offered him my vulnerable heart, and he had thrown it away like dirty garbage. He chose his dark, rusty machine over his only daughter's wedding day. He truly did not love me at all. I cried bitter, angry tears. I ripped the returned invitation into tiny, broken pieces and threw them into the trash. I told David that my father was completely dead to me. I promised myself I would never think about that cold, selfish man for the rest of my life. But I was completely blind to the tragic truth. I did not know why his handwriting was so terribly shaky and messy. He was not being cold or lazy. He was suffering from severe, painful nerve damage. 15 years of breathing toxic soldering chemicals had slowly destroyed his central nervous system. His hands, the beautiful, precise tools of his trade, were almost completely paralyzed. He could barely hold a simple pen, but he forced his failing, dying muscles to write that cruel note. He pushed me away again because he was hiding a dark, painful tragedy inside that locked workroom. He was fighting a terrible, silent battle that I could not see. My wedding day was bright, sunny, and absolutely beautiful. I stood in a private room at the grand church, wearing a stunning white silk dress. My friends were smiling and taking pictures. I felt like a true princess. The painful memory of my father was pushed far away from my mind. Just minutes before the wedding music began, there was a loud knock on the door. A serious man in a dark gray suit walked into the room. He was not a wedding guest. He was a formal lawyer from my hometown. He looked at my white dress with very sad eyes. "I am incredibly sorry to interrupt your special day, Elara," the lawyer said softly. He held a thick brown folder in his hands. "I bring terrible news. Your father, Elias, passed away late last night." The bright room suddenly felt freezing cold. The world around me completely stopped moving. My father was dead. He died alone in his dark workroom while I was preparing for a happy party. I could not speak. The lawyer gently placed the brown folder onto a small table. Then, he reached into his bag and pulled out a heavy, familiar object. It was the ugly, burned metal block. The rusty machine that stole my father's life was now sitting on my clean, white wedding table. "He wanted you to have this today," the lawyer whispered. I stared at the metal block in horror. I hated that machine with all my soul. "Why did he die?" I asked, my voice shaking with confusion and sudden grief. The lawyer opened the thick medical folder. "He died of severe respiratory failure," he explained. "He spent 15 years breathing highly toxic fumes from burning lead and acid. The chemicals completely destroyed his lungs." The lawyer turned a page in the medical file. "But that is not the worst part, Elara," he continued, looking at me with deep pity. "The toxic chemicals also destroyed his auditory nerves. Your father had been completely, 100% stone deaf for the last 5 years of his life." My legs felt incredibly weak. I fell into a chair, gasping for air. "Deaf," I cried loudly. "But he was working on an audio machine. How could he fix a sound machine if he could not hear anything?" It was a completely impossible, crazy paradox. "He did it by touch," the lawyer explained, tears forming in his own eyes. "For 5 years, he lived in absolute, total silence. He carefully repaired the tiny, broken wires by feeling the microscopic vibrations on his wooden desk with his scarred fingertips. He rebuilt an entire world of sound while trapped in the dark." The truth hit me like a violent storm. My father was not crazy. He was a desperate, suffering man trying to perform an impossible miracle. He traded his hearing, his nervous system, and his very life for this ugly metal block. But I still did not know what the machine actually was. I sat alone in the quiet dressing room. The happy wedding guests were waiting outside in the large church, but my heart was completely broken. I stared at the ugly, burned metal machine on the table. My beautiful white wedding dress felt heavy and cold against my skin. My father had sacrificed his hearing, his health, and his life for this machine. I slowly reached out my shaking hand. I touched the cold, rusty metal. On the side of the block, there was a small, custom-made brass winding key. It was made from my melted childhood trophies. I took a deep breath and slowly turned the brass key. It clicked loudly in the silent room. I wound it tightly and let it go. I closed my eyes, expecting to hear a beautiful, sweet, magical melody. I expected to hear the final, perfect masterpiece of a genius clockmaker. But the machine did not play music. The metal block began to spin, producing a horrible, loud, screeching noise. It sounded like violent electric static and sharp scratching. It was a chaotic, ugly, painful sound. There was absolutely no melody, no music, and no beauty in the terrible noise. I covered my ears, completely horrified. I fell to my knees on the floor and cried in pure, desperate agony. He really was crazy. He had destroyed our family, melted my past, and died a painful death for a broken machine that only made terrible, screaming noise. It was all for nothing. Suddenly, the door opened. David, my handsome groom, rushed into the room. He saw me crying on the floor and heard the terrible, screeching machine. He immediately knelt beside me and hugged me tightly. "Elara, "What is happening?" he asked with deep concern. "What is that noise?" I pointed to the ugly metal block. "It is my father's machine." I sobbed loudly. "He died for this." "But it is just broken garbage. It makes no sense." David did not turn off the machine. He was a brilliant, professional sound engineer. He listened very closely to the chaotic static. David's eyes widened in sudden surprise. He leaned closer to the rusty block. "Elara, stop crying and listen to me," David said with intense excitement. "This is not a traditional music box. It does not use metal pins to play musical notes. This is a brilliant piece of forgotten technology." I looked at him, completely confused. "What do you mean?" I whispered. David pointed to a tiny, hair-thin wire spinning inside the machine. "This is a primitive magnetic wire recorder. It is playing an actual audio recording. But the machine is missing an audio amplifier. The static noise is a real voice, Elara," David explained quickly. "But the tiny speaker is too small and broken to project the sound waves properly. We cannot hear the true audio. This machine needs a massive acoustic resonator to amplify the delicate magnetic vibrations into clear human sound." I did not understand what David was saying. "A massive acoustic resonator?" I asked, wiping the wet tears from my face. "Where can we find a machine like that right now?" David smiled gently. He stood up and carefully picked up the rusty, heavy metal block. "You have been playing one your entire life, my love," David said softly. He grabbed my hand and led me out of the small dressing room. We walked into the massive, beautiful church hall. Hundreds of wedding guests sat in total silence, watching us in pure shock and confusion. We did not stop to explain. David led me directly to the center of the large stage. Sitting proudly in the middle of the church was a giant, beautiful, black grand piano. It was the expensive instrument I was supposed to play during our wedding ceremony. David carefully opened the heavy, wooden lid of the giant piano. He reached deep inside and gently placed the rusty metal block directly onto the smooth, wooden soundboard. The massive, hollow body of the grand piano would act as a giant, perfect wooden speaker. It would perfectly amplify the tiny, delicate vibrations of the wire. "Are you ready, Elara?" David whispered gently. I nodded my head, my whole body shaking with intense fear and wild hope. David reached inside the piano and slowly turned the brass key. The small machine clicked and began to spin again. The tiny magnetic wire started to move. This time, the terrible, screeching static did not fill the air. The giant wooden body of the grand piano caught the tiny vibrations. The beautiful would amplify the magnetic signals perfectly. The sound was suddenly loud, clear, and absolutely terrifying. It was not music. It was a violent nightmare. The entire church echoed with the terrifying sound of squealing car tires. We heard the loud, crushing sound of heavy metal hitting rock. We heard glass breaking into a million pieces. The wedding guests gasped in horror. It was the exact, horrific sound of a deadly car crash. I covered my mouth in pure shock. I was listening to the exact moment my mother died 15 years ago. The terrible crashing sound stopped. The church was filled with the sound of heavy, difficult breathing. Someone was trapped inside the burning car. The heavy breathing was very weak and incredibly painful. Then a voice began to speak softly through the giant piano. The sound was incredibly clear, sweet, and wonderfully familiar. It was a beautiful voice that I had not heard in 15 long, lonely years. The hot tears flowed freely down my shocked, pale face. It was the voice of my beautiful mother, Clara. She was speaking from the dark, burning ashes of the past. The rusty metal machine was not a broken toy. It was a time machine, carrying her final, dying breath across 15 years to find me on my wedding day. The entire church was perfectly, completely silent. Everyone listened to the ghostly voice echoing from the grand piano. My mother, Clara, was not singing a song. The ugly metal block was a brilliant invention. It was the world's very first portable, magnetic voice recorder, built perfectly by my genius father. When her car crashed down the dangerous mountain, my mother knew she was trapped. She knew she was going to die in the terrible fire. In her final, agonizing moments of life, she did not panic. She used her last strength to turn on my father's special machine. She recorded a final, desperate message before the bright flames consumed her car. Little Elara, my mother's sweet, weak voice whispered through the grand piano. I am so sorry. I cannot come home tonight. I will not be able to watch you grow up into a beautiful woman. I fell to my knees beside the piano, sobbing uncontrollably. But I know something very important, my sweet girl, my mother's voice continued, coughing softly. I know that on the day you wear your white wedding dress, you will be the most beautiful bride in the whole world. Do not be sad for me today. The voice echoed warmly across the large church. I am always with you in your beautiful music. I love you so much, my brave girl. Congratulations on your wedding day. The voice faded away into the soft sound of a crackling fire. The tape clicked and the machine stopped completely. The 15-second message was over. The silence returned, but it was not a cold silence anymore. It was filled with profound, overwhelming love. My mother had blessed my wedding day from the dark ashes of the past. I realized the true, unimaginable scale of my father's sacrifice. He had found this melted, destroyed machine in the hot ashes. The tiny magnetic wire inside was burned and broken into thousands of microscopic pieces. He had spent 15 agonizing years locked in a dark room. He had breathed toxic, deadly chemicals every single day. He had carefully glued and soldered thousands of microscopic, invisible wire fragments back together. He did this while slowly going completely deaf and destroying his own lungs. He sacrificed his entire life for 15 seconds of sound. He traded his own health, his reputation, and his relationship with me just to save his dead wife's final blessing. He wanted to give me the ultimate, perfect wedding gift. He wanted to bring my mother back from the dead, just for one beautiful minute on my most important day. I sat on the floor in my white dress, crying tears of pure gratitude and deep, terrible regret. My father was not a crazy monster. He was the greatest, most devoted hero I had ever known. He loved me more than his own life. He just loved me in complete silence. The wedding guests were all crying softly in the church. David held my hand tightly as I stood up from the floor. The serious lawyer walked up to the grand piano. He reached into his dark bag one final time. He handed me a folded, white piece of paper. This is a letter your father wrote yesterday, the lawyer whispered kindly. He asked me to give it to you after you heard the recording. I opened the letter with shaking fingers. The handwriting was terrible and messy because his nerves were completely destroyed by the toxic chemicals. My dearest Elara, the letter began. I am so sorry I was a terrible father. I am sorry I melted your beautiful trophies. I needed that exact brass material because it had the perfect magnetic resonance to rebuild the machine. Your victories were the only things that saved her voice. More tears fell onto the white paper. I read the next paragraph, and my heart shattered completely. I know you hated me for never attending your piano concerts, my father wrote. But you must understand. The magnetic wire inside the machine was thinner than a single human hair. My tiny welds were incredibly fragile, the letter explained painfully. If I sat in a concert hall, the powerful acoustic vibrations from your beautiful piano music would instantly shatter the delicate wire. It would destroy your mother's voice forever. I had to avoid all loud music and live in total silence. He had to stay away from the music he loved. He had to stay away from the daughter he loved. I had to make a terrible choice, Elara, the letter concluded. I chose to never hear you play your beautiful piano, so you could hear her voice on your happiest day. I love you. My father chose to be hated. He chose isolation, deafness, and a lonely death. He sacrificed his own joy to protect a fragile, invisible thread of love. He was the true master of time. He had successfully stopped time and reversed a tragedy, paying for the miracle with his own life. I folded the letter and held it against my heart. I looked at the beautiful grand piano and the rusty metal block sitting on the soundboard. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt an incredible, powerful sense of peace. I sat down on the wooden piano bench. I placed my hands on the black and white keys. I closed my eyes and began to play the traditional wedding march. I played it louder, more beautifully, and more passionately than I had ever played in my entire life. The music filled the massive church with glorious, brilliant sound. I played the music for my beautiful mother, and I played it for my genius, silent father. I finally understood his complex, tragic love. As the music soared into the high ceiling, I knew my father was finally listening from a better place, and his hands were finally, perfectly at peace.